How's it going, everyone? I hope y'all are having a good day so far. And we'll get into the lecture pretty soon. Hopefully, well, first of all, do y'all have any questions over what we covered last time? Parts of section 1, 2, and 3? Okay, no questions from homework or anything else? Okay. So we'll start off with section 1.4 today, which is on other sampling methods. So when we look at other we talked about simple random sampling last time, and there's a variety of ways we can achieve that. When we look at other sampling methods, there are going to be some pros and cons to these, including there's also pros and cons to random sampling. So let's discuss all the other methods first, and then we'll talk about some of the pros and cons. So the first method that we'll talk about in this section is what we call a systematic sampling. And in systematic sampling, the idea is that we choose every, and I'll say nth individual to sample or gather data from in this case. So when we say we want to choose every nth individual, that might mean that we might, in a class of 30 people, if we want to create a 5-person sample, we might choose every 5th person on the list. So let's say we have a population of 30 students. And we want a sample of 5. Now, when we say we want to choose every nth individual, we also need to choose a starting point. Like maybe we'll pick the first one that we sample at random, like anywhere from 1 to 5. So let's say we randomly select 3. So we'll start at the third person, and let's say we count by 5. From there. So starting from the third person, we count 5 after that. That would give us, so we would sample the 8th person in the class. Likely this would be done alphabetically, but it's similar to random sampling where you have like a number for each individual in the population. In this case, we would list students from 1 through 30, which usually by alphabetical order is what we would do. In other cases, like if we're working on an assembly line and that something's being manufactured, we might choose every 5th item to check for defects, or every 100th, or every 50th, or whatever is comfortable from a quality control perspective. So here, 3 plus 5, the 8th person, add 5 more, would get the 13th person, add 5 more, we would get to the 18th person, 5 more from there, we get to the 23rd, and 5 more from there, we get to the 28th person. So that would be our 5 people that we would use for our sample, and we achieve that through a systematic approach. So when we say systematic, we would basically, the giveaway that a sampling method is systematic is that we would take every so often, we pick every so often, every 10th individual, every 5th individual, just whatever the size of the population and the sample size needed dictates. If we wanted a sample of 10 students out of 30, we would probably count by 3s. If we wanted a sample of 7 students, we might count by 4s. Whatever can easily be contained by the sample size. And as you can imagine, I'm actually just dividing those numbers together to figure that out. 30 divided by 5 actually gives us 6, so I could have counted by 6s, but if we're starting from the third person, that makes it a little more difficult. Anyway. Excuse me. Now, so that's a systematic sample. It's a relatively easy approach, I think, or simple compared to some of the other things we looked at so far. We're just choosing every so many, counting every so many just to get an individual for the sample. Alright, so after that, we'll look at what's called I think we do stratified next, right? Yeah, stratified sample is next. Now for a stratified sample, the idea behind this is that we'll go ahead and divide the population into what we call related subgroups. watch out for paper cuts. Now, when we say related, this is kind of an important word here. It means that the individuals that we put into these subgroups all have some kind of aspect about them that they share in common. In market research, a lot of the times that when we're doing like advertising research, that kind of thing, groups are broken up according to age, for instance. Like you might have an under 18 age group, 18 through 35, 36 through 49, and then 50, sometimes 50 to 64, or just 50 plus. But in each of those age groups, they have a similar age, and they can see, when you sell advertising for on Hulu, for instance, or you're selling advertising on an actual television, or just for websites, if you look at the general age range of individuals that are going to those websites or streaming those shows or watching the shows on TV, they generally break it down according to usually gender and age range, like both factors, and they can then pick advertisements that they think will be relevant to those subgroups. And if you look at a show like you have music award shows. I think we just had one. It was like MTV or something. Those tend to be widely viewed by people under the age of 30 and frequently less than 20 in a lot of cases. Larger groups of teenagers and college students. So in that regard, traditional college age, in that regard, we would say, okay, we want to target advertisements towards this group that we think people in these age ranges, and then also maybe gender as well, break them up a little bit further into more subgroups, we think will be something that they would enjoy. If you watch sporting events, it's largely dominated by adult males, so you tend to see a lot of things targeted towards them. Car commercials, alcohol commercials, that's the big ones right there. I guess luxury goods fit in there for whatever reason, like jewelry and like watches or whatever. Anyway, but then you watch like the Academy Awards, and it's a little bit more targeted towards women because they know their audience largely is made up of women in those instances, for whatever reason. But that's what they've based their, they've seen in past performances of these things, and they expect to continue to be true. So in a way, it kind of marginalizes the groups that are make up lower populations as far as the consumers in those cases, but they can just ignore the commercials anyway. But in order to get the most impact, you want to focus on the groups that are going to be there watching, and then having those commercials play. It's a lot easier to do market research as far as advertising goes online, because a lot of the times, you're using the same email for Facebook and Amazon and Twitter and Instagram and whatever, and they can see, okay, what products are you buying on Amazon, and then maybe you'll like similar products or related products, and we'll show you these advertisements, and you see that happen quite a bit. So this is where stratified samples end up being used quite a bit. Although what we're doing with the stratified sample is a little bit more general. We're not trying to focus on one subgroup. We actually want to be able to draw our sample from all of the subgroups. The idea with a stratified sample now is that no longer we're just working on one subgroup. We want to make sure each of the subgroups in the population that we're looking at are represented in the sample that we collect, so we have a little bit more accurate information that we can gather based on that. So population is divided into related subgroups, and then we randomly select individuals from each subgroup. Okay, and the goal there is, again, each subgroup gets represented in the sample. And there's different ways to do that. A lot of it depends on knowing at the outset which individuals belong to which subgroups are we interested in, or do we have ages for each of the individuals that we're looking at? Do we know race or ethnicity? Do we know gender? Different things like that. So we can make sure that, okay, all genders are represented in a relatively equal manner, all races. Might break it up by economic status. We don't always have all this information, so it's difficult to do. It's really a matter of how much information do we have and how far can we split them into groups, split our subjects into groups. So anyway, but that's the general concept of a stratified sample. It does require that we have a decent knowledge of the population to begin with. So maybe, we're doing some work for the college. Now at the college, when you register, we take a lot of different demographic information as part of your application process. So we certainly know how old everyone is, and you probably filled in your gender, and then I don't know if we ask race. Usually we depending on what you're looking at, it's split up a little bit differently, but to some extent that information is covered, I believe. And we might say, okay, we want a sample of 100 people. Midland College's population is slightly majority female, so we'll make sure we choose a few more women at random than men for our sample. So maybe 51 women and 49 men in our sample. But then we break them up according to housing status, maybe. Do they live on campus? Do they live in an apartment off campus? Or do they rent or own a house off campus? And we look at their different living situations, and maybe we get information from each of those groups, and then we ask them, how do you get to school each day? So like the ones that are living on campus, they'll walk. Even some of those that live in apartments that are nearby the college may walk, or houses that are pretty close by. And others may drive, others may take the bus, others may ride the bicycle, and there's a lot of, just figuring out how people get to campus, what kind of need do we have for buses, do we need the buses to run a little more often to accommodate people's needs, whatever it is that we're trying to study. And so we can get information that way. I don't know why we would need age in that particular situation, but that's an element, I guess, in some cases. It just depends what we're trying to figure out and what it is we're focusing on. So in a stratified sample, again, the idea is that we break up the population into different subgroups and then try to select individuals from each subgroup. Now, when we pick individuals, we want to, like, our subgroups may not always be equal in size, so we may not get the same number of individuals from each subgroup. So if, like I said before, if the majority of the college population is female, slight majority, so it's like 51-52%, something like that, then we'll make sure that we have a little bit more women in our study than we do men to accommodate that particular difference in the relative proportions in the overall population. If I can say all the words properly, sorry. So if we have more, slightly more than half of the students are Hispanic, then we'll certainly draw about at least half of our data from that subgroup versus the other subgroups. Okay. I don't know exactly how that breaks down by race, but anyway. All right. Next we have cluster samples. So a cluster sample, we again start off by breaking up the population into related subgroups. But once we do that, and that's already, it starts off the same way as the stratified sample does. But here's where it diverges, here's where it goes away. We then select all members of only a few of these subgroups as the sample. So we then select a few, and it really depends on how many we need, a few subgroups and sample all members of the selected subgroups. Okay. Now, this one's a little more challenging, but first of all, let's compare that with stratified. So stratified, well, both cases we start with breaking people or the population up into related subgroups. Stratified, we randomly select individuals to sample from each subgroup. Whereas with the cluster, we select a few subgroups and sample all members from those selected subgroups. So we'll only get a few from each group here, whereas with the cluster, we get all members from just a couple groups. It may only be one group. It just depends on how large our population is and how large we would like our sample to be. Now, the best description of this in action that I've seen that is easily explainable is one. This is one from our textbook. Let me find it real quick. Okay, this is example 3 on page 31 if you want to look at it. hate messing with the camera. Okay. So a sociologist wants to gather data regarding household income within the city of Boston. And we obtain a sample using a cluster sampling. So the city of Boston can be set up so that each city block is a cluster. Once the city blocks have identified, we then obtain a simple random sample of the city blocks and survey all households on the blocks selected. So let's say in the city of Boston, there's 10,493 different city blocks. So first, the sociologist must number the blocks from 1 to 10,493, and they only have enough time and money to survey 20 of these clusters, or 20 city blocks. The sociologist should obtain a simple random sample of 20 numbers. So basically, the sociologist knows she only has enough time and money to collect sample data from 20 city blocks. But by labeling the city blocks 1 through 10,493, she's hoping that the 20 that she chooses are at different places in the city so that she does get a representative population. Okay, we don't want all 20 clusters to be in one particular area of the city, because you would then get a lot of similarity with those that does not necessarily hold true from one area of the city to another. Especially in these East Coast cities, you see a lot of communities built up according to where they immigrated from. Like you might have, like in Boston, certainly there's a larger Irish section. You might have an Italian section, and then Chinese, or different Hispanic subgroups as well. Different sections of each, and depending on where you are in the city, you may get if you have a lot of your sample, or if a lot of your clusters that you choose are in one region, you might get a bunch of individuals from just one of those ethnic groups, and that may throw off our results consequently. And so one thing that the researcher can do in this case is look at a map and make sure that all of the ones that have been randomly selected just don't happen to be in like very close proximity, I guess. Now, if it's a random sample, it's unlikely to be the case, but there's you like to have a little bit of a confirmation of that. Otherwise, it really throws off the results. So, she has a random sample of 20 numbers between 1 and 10,493. And then she can go in and sample or get surveys from each household in these clusters that were selected. In this case, it's a good choice, cluster sampling, because it reduces the travel time. That way she only has to go to 20 different parts of the city, versus just randomly selecting 5,000 people from Boston and having to go to 5,000 different places in the city. It's a massive time savings and money savings as far as travel time and whether she drives or takes public transportation and so on. Probably public transportation. Anyway, in addition, there's no need to obtain a frame of all the households with cluster sampling. We just don't have to. It really eliminates a lot of the concerns in this scenario. So, all right. Probably this seems a little scary at this point, but don't worry about it too much just yet. Biggest thing that we want to do is with this particular topic is we would like to make sure you know, if we're given a series of paragraphs, can we, or descriptions of samples, can we pick out which one is which one is a random sample, which one is a stratified, which one is cluster, or the other one that we're about to look at, which is convenience sampling. Is that the other one? Yeah. Oh, systematic was the other one. I forgot to mention. Sorry. Anyway, convenience sampling. Oh, let's see. I messed up my camera. Now I have to fix it. Okay. Now, a convenience sample. This is a sample that, as the name suggests, is collected in as easy a manner as possible. So, when we say as easy a manner as possible, there's multiple ways that this could be called different multiple ways we can collect a convenience sample. One, we could send out a survey to every single household in Midland, Texas, and just whichever surveys are returned, those are the ones that we'll base our results on. If we want to know, like if we own a grocery store and we want to know what people think about our store, if they have any ideas for improvement or any flaws that they see, then we can set up a table in front of our store where shoppers come, and they may opt to fill out a survey for a coupon, 10% off something, for instance. We could, another good example of a convenience sample is radio call-in shows. So like a talk show, like you would see people call into. Usually these are like political talk shows nowadays, that you would see that. And then, people would basically self-select themselves to participate in the sample by calling in and presenting their opinion on whatever topic is being discussed. Now, in each of these cases I mentioned, convenience sampling is really, it gives you results. It doesn't necessarily give you what we would call representative results. There are some serious problems with convenience sampling in particular, but other sampling methods may have similar issues. But with convenience sampling in particular, when people are basically volunteering information about something, the problem is that you don't know if that's the results that you're getting. Do they represent the entire population, or do they just represent the sample of people that returned information to you? So in the case of sending out a survey to every single person in Midland and just basing our data off of whoever responds to that, for one thing, we may not get a lot of responses. It may only get 50, 100 or so responses. Most people don't like filling out surveys. That's an extra step. Some people do enjoy it, which is fine. And especially if it's something that we have a strong opinion about, we're more likely to fill out a survey about it. And that's kind of like when you read reviews for items online, like on Amazon or whatever. You tend to see a lot of 5-star reviews, and you also see a fair number of 1 and 2-star reviews, the lower reviews. You don't necessarily see a lot of 3-star reviews, because what happens is the ones that feel the strongest about the product are also the ones that are most likely to leave a comment regarding the product, where either they had an incredibly good experience or they had an incredibly bad experience. Those are the ones that we tend to see more often. Those are the more visible ones, the more helpful ones that are labeled as such by other individuals. So those are sometimes non-representative, but they have the highest visibility on those particular items, which is problematic from the perspective of someone trying to sell those items, or the company that manufactures that item. So when you look at a grocery store wanting to know what people like about the store, how they could improve it, but they're only if they set up like a table in front of their store and offer coupons to people for people that fill out the survey. For one thing, the people that are participating in that survey are already biased towards the store, in favor of the store, because they're already at the store coming to shop. So if I don't like a particular supermarket or a grocery store, I'm probably not going to be there in the first place. Okay? So the grocery store is not getting information from the people who have a serious problem with their store. They're getting information from people who already like their store in that scenario and may only see minor improvements that may, things that don't really bother them too much, but it could be better, basically. The ones that see major issues aren't shopping there in the first place. For instance, I have a friend who won't shop at H-E-B because she's claustrophobic and she doesn't like walking down the rows there. She feels that they're too tall and they're too close together for her comfort. Okay, so that's a concern, but that they would probably never hear in that scenario if they were just asking their normal customers. So the radio call-in show, again, it's another example where there's a lot of bias present in the people that respond to that. If you present an issue, whether it's about politics or sports, the people most likely to call in are the ones that heavily favor or are heavily against that particular issue. It's even worse in politics because a lot of these are kind of centralized, like for one side of politics versus the other. A lot of them are centralized on like one station. Like you're not going to get a lot of left-leaning individuals responding to a right-leaning call-in show, for instance. A lot of the people that call in already believe in what they're talking about and then believe strongly, and they heavily support that. And it's really just self-reinforcing at that point. You're not really getting any new information. You're getting the same information repeated or re-emphasized. So from that standpoint, we're not, in each of those three standpoints, there's a lot of heavy bias one way or another happening, and that's the kind of thing that we would prefer not be in our sample. If we want a truly objective opinion about whatever it is we're researching, then we need to make sure we eliminate scenarios such as that. That's why convenience sampling is really not a good method of conducting research. In some cases, it's all that's available, so it's a complicated thing. It's also the easiest thing to do, so it's always something people are looking at doing just for the sake of simplicity. But if you really want good results, it's usually not the method to choose. I don't know if there's any good example of where convenience sampling is effective at describing what you're researching. So if we look at the other ones, cluster sampling and stratified sampling are actually pretty good at eliminating bias, because by their very nature, the individuals are already separated into subgroups relevant to the topic at hand. That way we're making sure, in the case of stratified, each subgroup is represented, or in the case of cluster sampling, we either we should still be relatively represented for each group in a way, or we're interested in only one group in the first place. That's why we break them into subgroups. So there's different ways to look at that. Random sampling is hit or miss, because with random samples there's no guarantee that your entire population is properly represented in the sample that you end up selecting at random. If the sample size is large enough, then yes, it's generally the case that it's representative. But if you end up having a smaller sample size, it may not accurately represent the entire population. So there's things to be considered there. But yeah, convenience is generally regarded as not a great sampling method. So. Okay. So in the textbook, I'm on page 34 now. I want to try to do this without giving away answers. So it's going to be a little awkward. Well, let's look at number 12 here in section 1.4. To determine the prevalence of human growth hormone use among high school varsity baseball players, the State Athletic Commission randomly selects 50 high schools. All members of the selected high school's varsity baseball teams are tested for HGH. So what kind of sampling method is applied in that case? This it seems a little tricky at the outset. But essentially we can think of these different teams as different subgroups. Yes, cluster, exactly. Each team is a different subgroup, and we randomly select 50, and we get information from all members of those 50 teams. And that is, by definition, a cluster sample. Good. Okay. So number 14. Whoops. Showing the answer on the screen again. A member of Congress wishes to determine her constituency's opinion regarding estate taxes. She divides her constituency into 3 income classes, low, medium, and high. She then takes a simple random sample of households from each of those income classes. So which sampling method would that represent? Stratified? Good. We know it's stratified because 1, it's broken up into multiple groups, in this case income classes, and 2, we now take a random sample from each of those groups. Good. A radio station asks its listeners to call in their opinion regarding the use of U.S. forces in peacekeeping missions. What kind of sampling is the radio station doing? Yeah, convenience sampling. Basically, they're just trying to get as easy a sample as possible. And really, for a radio station, that's all they can really do is convenience samples. But it's really not representative. A college official divides the student population into 5 classes: freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, and graduate student. The official takes a simple random sample from each of those classes and asks the members' opinions regarding student services. Right, that one is stratified again. Good. Mm-hmm. So the next one, the presider of a guest lecture series at a university stands outside the auditorium before the lecture begins and hands every fifth person who arrives, beginning with the third, a speaker evaluation survey to be completed and returned at the end of the program. Systematic? Mm-hmm. Good. That's good. All of you seem on board with the same answers, which is nice. Let's see. 24-Hour Fitness wants to administer a satisfaction survey to its current members. Using its membership roster, the club randomly selects 40 club members and asks them about their level of satisfaction with the club. It does sound a little bit like a convenience sample, and I understand where you're getting that. We are asking our club members how they feel about their club, but in this case, they kind of have to ask their club members because they want to ask the people who are actually using the fitness club and see if they have any what their level of satisfaction is. Now, there's also people on their roster that maybe not be using the club, and they can also explain why. So it's not just people who come in the door, it's all people who have like a paid membership. There is a degree of convenience there because the people who are very dissatisfied may no longer have a membership. But it's not necessarily convenience. There's a better method that describes this. So we took our entire roster of members and selected 40 at random. We didn't break them into groups, so it can't be stratified, can't be clustered. We didn't pick every 10th member from the roster, so it can't be systematic. And we know it's not convenient. Sorry, we already talked about that one. So the only thing left is it has to be just simple random sampling. Yeah. Now, you may not have realized that simple random sampling was a possible answer here because we talked about it in section 1.3. But the possible answers here are the ones for the simple random from 1.3 as well as the 4 that we talked about in section 1.4. I may have thrown you all off by not mentioning that, so I apologize for that. Okay. So again, there is an element of convenience there, but overall, when you have a roster and you select 40 at random, that act alone right there is simple random sampling. I know, I will be, what I've actually done on the test, and this you'll find helpful, I think, is I've actually made it a matching question on the test. So there's 4 descriptions with 4 answers, and you just write the letter as the answer to each description, basically. That won't be confusing by that point. So. All right. Any questions on our sampling methods there? Okay. So we're going to move on from there. I'm going to skip 1.5 and 1.6. You're certainly welcome. I encourage you to read over those two sections, but we're not going to test over those two sections. I'm going to go ahead and get us started on Chapter 2 today. We still have a bit of time. Now, Chapter 2 is on organizing and summarizing data. And the idea is, in Chapter 1, we talked about how we can get data, how we can create a sample from a population, and we would then carry out whatever method we had for gathering that data from that sample, whether it's a survey or interview each of those individuals in the sample or things like that. So now that we have the data, the question is, what are some ways that we can organize, summarize, and basically display the data in a meaningful manner so that people can look at it and gain some insight potentially. So section 2.1, which we'll talk about first, is on organizing qualitative data. Now, we said qualitative before. We called this categorical, just for reference. So the idea with categorical data, going back to section 1.1, I believe, we talked about categorical and quantitative variables. So categorical variables and the accompanying categorical data. This is information that describes individuals in a non-numeric, not counted, not measured, but describes the individuals. So we might ask, what location do you want to one day visit on vacation? And we can get a bunch of different answers from people, and then we can collect our answers and organize that and display it. And we can see what vacation destination people are most interested in. We may say, what is everyone's favorite color? Something as simple as that. And we can create a display that illustrates what the most frequently chosen favorite color is. So there's different things we can do here, but the idea is we have all this categorical or qualitative data. How do we put it together in a meaningful way? Now, when we have categorical data, there's really there's a couple of formats that we could potentially use. We could use a bar graph. We could use a pie chart. I'm not going to have us do any pie charts because those are difficult to do by hand, and honestly they're not great. They're better. They're nice visual representation for people that are more visually oriented, but it's not a great way to convey differences in sizes always, and somewhat inefficient to create, especially if we have a lot of different options there. Pie charts are great if we have like 4 choices, and none of them are like super small, but also none of them are well, some of them may be super large. But we tend to use for qualitative or categorical data excuse me, we tend to use the bar graph as kind of our primary tool in creating displays for this type of data. So when we talk about a bar graph, so we're not going to cover a pie chart, basically. So we have what's called a basic bar graph. So our general format here is along the bottom. We certainly want to have a title to the graph, so people know when we show this to someone as part of our research, whatever it is that we're using it for, people know what they're looking at. What does this graph represent? We want to be able to communicate that. So we have a title. We have two axes here. We have a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. Typically, on the horizontal axis, we'll put the individual data values, like the different data values that were selected. So if we're thinking about vacation destinations, we might say Hawaii, when we can travel again, Alaska, Europe, Central America. Not going out too far. I'm just needing some basic examples here. So our title would be destinations, vacation destinations. Maybe we can be a little bit more descriptive. And so we want to make sure we label this axis. So we will say locations is a good way. It doesn't have to be real wordy. We just want it relatively simple, but concisely convey, what these represent relative to the study the research that we've done. Now, on this vertical side, we'll make some markings. And maybe this is the percent of people that chose these different locales. Okay. Sorry. And then from there, we'd create bars that have the appropriate height to indicate the percent of people that chose those destinations. So maybe 20% of the individuals chose Hawaii, maybe 5% chose Alaska, maybe 35% chose Europe, which is kind of general, but I'm just creating 4 outcomes here. And then what's left? 25, 35 is 60. So maybe another 25% chose Central America. And there's some other options, but we have, maybe I'll add one more category, other, which would be the remaining 15%. Okay. Ideally, that would add up to 100 if I did the math right. Yeah, Mexico. Do we include Mexico as part of Central? Mexico is part of North America, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, it is. Yeah, so we could say Mexico here. Okay. Anyway, for whatever reason, our study only had 5 responses, although Europe, like I said, is pretty general because someone could want to go to France or Italy, for instance. Maybe they don't want to go to England. But anyway, I'm just making up categories here. So we wanted to make sure we labeled the 2 axes. We made sure to label the different outcomes here, and then on the other axis, either how many or what percentage. It could go either way. If we just said maybe we had 30 people in this poll, and 6 of them chose Hawaii, that represents 20%, so we could use 20%, or we could use 6. Just whatever way we want to go with that. Percent usually conveys a little bit more idea of scale better, so frequently we'll use percent more often than just the individual numbers, so it just depends. Okay, so that's the idea of a bar graph, though. Now, we look at this and we think, well, what might be the most useful thing that we could gather from this bar graph? And probably what we're interested in doing in performing this research in the first place is which destination locations are going to be the most popular for people from this area. And so I like to think I picked some of them at least. Probably Mexico would be higher than Europe, but anyway, maybe not. I'll probably switch these two, and it doesn't matter. So there's actually a variation on the bar graph that we do use as an alternative in creating qualitative or categorical displays, and that is what we call the Pareto chart. So a Pareto chart, this is a bar graph still. The difference is, rather than being given like an alphabetical order, for instance, or something like that, the bars are arranged so that the one with the highest number of responses is listed first, and then they go in descending order from there. A bar graph where the bars are arranged from highest to lowest. So in this scenario, we'd still keep our same designations on the vertical axis. Another thing I want to point out is that on any bar graph that we create, whenever we number this side here, we want to make sure that we're counting by the same number each time, so everything is equally spaced. If they're not equally spaced, then it distorts the image, basically. It gives a distorted perception of the image. So, which bar is higher versus which bar is not as high as the next. So, now our categories, though, we want to rearrange so that the highest one is first. So in the graph that I created before, Europe had the largest bar, which went all the way up to 35%. After that, we had Central America. Let's go visit the rainforests of Costa Rica. That would be nice. That was 25%. After that, we had Hawaii at 20%. And again, completely making up these numbers. The nice thing about the problems in the book is that you can find a source in a lot of them that they're based on reality. We said Mexico at 15. And I think a lot of people would say Mexico to visit their family. But if we're going on vacation, do we want to go visit family? Or if we're thinking about a vacation, not just to visit family, but separate from that, maybe just go somewhere where we just haven't been before, you know. Anyway, not that it's bad to visit family, but sometimes it's nice to do our own thing. And then Alaska at 5%. Okay, and so the difference with the Pareto chart now is that we can see the bars are now in descending order. So our highest, most popular choice is first, and then descending order. This is actually what, if anyone was reading this particular study, or you know, the researcher presenting the study in the first place, this would be what they're likely most interested in, is which one had the highest number of results, and which were the most popular guess or choices in this for this research, and we would go from there. So now we talked about the bar graph before. Now it doesn't have to be a vertical bar graph. We could actually set the bar graph up where the bars are going horizontally, and we have list our percentage at the bottom. It doesn't have to necessarily be arranged this way, although most of the time we do tend to write our bar graphs where the bars are vertical. It's possible that we do it horizontally, and that's acceptable as well. It looks a little different, and in some cases, if we have, depending on the space we have available in the article that we're trying to create, for instance, it may make more sense to do it one way versus the other. So, generally, with Pareto charts, we do go ahead and make them vertical, but again, it's not a strict requirement either. Does that make sense, what we're talking about there? I don't think I'm really giving you a lot of new information at this point. You may not have heard of Pareto charts before, but that's maybe the only thing that's completely new here. I encourage you to read through the section, but yeah. Nope. All right. I think we're kind of at a stopping point. There's a little bit more I need to do for that section. Like there's some more vocabulary I need to go over, and some more definite, some more examples I would like to do. So for now, I'm just going to give you homework over section 1.4. Go ahead and look at, and this is on page 34, 11 through 21 odd. Okay. Sorry, it was just me talking most of the time today. I want it to be a little bit more interactive than that, since the course is supposed to be interactive to an extent. These the beginning of each chapter tends to be a little bit more talky as we go through definitions and foundational stuff. But the more we go through it, hopefully the more interactive, the more interesting it will be. So, yes, I'll post pictures later of the homework so y'all can look through that. But other than that, I guess we're done. But y'all have a good rest of the day. Take care, and I will talk to y'all again on Wednesday. Have a good one. I will create an exam schedule. I meant to do it Friday, and I was super lazy on Friday, to be honest. But I will get to it. We're still at least 2 weeks off from a test, so don't panic. You know, and before we take an exam, we'll also have a review session. So you'll know exactly what kind of things will be asked on the exam based on that. So don't worry about it just yet. It's okay, basically.